Lorena Gallo arrived in the United States from Ecuador with wide eyes and a heart full of dreams. Born in Bucuri in 1969, she was raised in a modest family and taught to value tradition, faith, and perseverance. In 1987, at just 18 years old, she came to Virginia on a student visa, determined to build a better life for herself and, eventually, to bring hope and opportunity to her family back home. She enrolled in a community college and worked as a manicurist to make ends meet. Lorena was quiet, polite, and by all accounts a gentle soul. Her dream was simple: to live a peaceful life in America, build a career, and one day marry a man who would love and protect her. In 1988, her path crossed with a young Marine named John Wayne Bobbitt at a local dance. Tall, with a charming smile and a confident air, John seemed like the embodiment of the American man Lorena had always envisioned. They began dating quickly. John, stationed at Marine Corps Base Quantico, swept Lorena off her feet with romantic gestures and promises of devotion. Within a year, the couple was married. At first glance, their wedding in June 1989 seemed like a fairy tale. A beautiful young immigrant and a proud serviceman, tying the knot in the land of opportunity. It was the image of a perfect start, but cracks soon began to appear. John's behavior changed drastically after the honeymoon. He became possessive, controlling, and often cruel. Lorena's friends later recalled that she began to withdraw and show signs of distress. She confided in some that John was not the man she thought he was. The emotional abuse gradually became physical. He would berate her in private and public, isolate her from friends, and allegedly took control of her earnings from her job at a nail salon. By 1990, just 1 year into their marriage, Lorena began experiencing what many victims of domestic abuse endure: fear, shame, confusion, and hopelessness. She was in a country far from home, without the full command of the language, and under the legal and emotional control of a man who was supposed to be her protector. Despite this, Lorena kept going. She tried to hold on to hope that things would change. She attended church, continued working, and rarely spoke of her troubles. The dream she had when she first arrived in the U.S. hadn't died. It was just buried under the growing weight of pain. Unbeknownst to anyone, Lorena had already begun the long, silent endurance that so many survivors face. The world had no idea yet, but the foundation was being laid for one of the most shocking and talked about moments in American criminal history. Lorena Bobbitt's days had become a quiet torment behind closed doors. To outsiders, she still tried to present a calm, smiling face, soft-spoken, polite, and hard-working. But those closest to her, including co-workers at the nail salon where she worked, began to notice the signs. Small bruises, sudden tears, a visible tension that never seemed to lift. And whenever John dropped by, the energy around her seemed to shrink. John Wayne Bobbitt, the once charismatic Marine, had grown increasingly erratic. His military career was already falling apart. He was discharged from the Marines and floated between jobs. The financial strain added fuel to his already volatile temper. He would often demand money from Lorena, despite her modest income. She supported them both while he drank, partied, and, according to later testimony, cheated repeatedly. Friends later recalled that John treated Lorena less like a partner and more like property. He controlled her movements, checked her spending, and flew into rages over imagined slights. Lorena, terrified of upsetting him, did what so many survivors do. She stayed quiet and tried to appease him, clinging to the hope that the man she married might return. But the abuse escalated. Lorena confided in her employer, Jan, who would later become a key witness. She spoke of physical beatings, of being held down and raped, of threats and humiliation. But like many women in abusive relationships, Lorena didn't report it to the police. She feared deportation, feared losing her place in the country she had worked so hard to stay in. And perhaps most of all, she feared John. In 1991, Lorena became pregnant. For a brief moment, she thought the child might change things, might bring some peace. But John didn't want a child. According to Lorena, he forced her to have an abortion. She was devastated, physically and emotionally. It was a turning point, a deeply traumatic moment that signaled just how little control she had over her own body, her own life. In interviews years later, Lorena would describe feeling trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. Domestic violence shelters and legal protections were harder to access back then, especially for immigrant women with limited resources. Divorce felt out of reach, both financially and emotionally. John, meanwhile, began to unravel even more. He drank heavily, disappeared for days, and was arrested multiple times, once for stealing and once for assault. His dark moods and violent temper became more frequent. But through it all, Lorena stayed, driven by fear, uncertainty, and the invisible chains that bind many survivors. In 1993, things came to a breaking point. The abuse was no longer sporadic, it was daily. Lorena, once filled with dreams and dignity, now lived in a constant state of terror. And no one, not the law, not friends, not family, seemed able to stop it. That summer, something inside her began to snap. It would take just one more violent night. 1993 started like many other nights in the Bobbitt household, tense, quiet, and charged with unspoken dread. Lorena had spent the day working at the nail salon, returning home to the small Manassas, Virginia apartment she shared with John. The atmosphere in their home had become a prison of fear. Every door creak, every footstep, every word could lead to rage. John came home late that night, having been out drinking with a friend. Lorena had grown used to his late arrivals and drunken moods, but something about that night felt different. In later court testimony, she would describe what happened in the hours leading up to the incident as yet another traumatic attack. She alleged that John raped her, a charge he would later deny. Afterward, John passed out in their bed. Lorena lay awake, her body trembling, her mind spinning. Years of abuse, humiliation, pain, and silence collided in those early morning hours. What went through her head in that moment has been the subject of endless speculation, legal scrutiny, and media frenzy. But Lorena has always insisted that she snapped, not in rage, but in desperation. Sometime around 4 a.m., Lorena got out of bed and went to the kitchen. She opened a drawer, pulled out an 8-inch carving knife, and returned to the bedroom. With John asleep and unresponsive, Lorena did the unthinkable. She severed his penis at the base. In shock and panic, she fled the apartment. Still holding the knife in one hand and the severed organ in the other, she got into her car and began driving aimlessly through the dark streets of Manassas. After a few miles, she flung the organ out of the window into a grassy field. Lorena eventually drove to her friend Jana's house and told her what happened. Jana called 911. At the same time, John had woken up screaming in pain and called for help. He was rushed to the hospital, losing copious amounts of blood. Police, acting on Lorena's statement, scoured the roadside for the missing body part, which they found hours later packed in a hot dog box. Miraculously, surgeons were able to reattach it in a 9.5-hour operation. The media pounced almost immediately. By the next day, the bizarre nature of the crime had turned it into a national sensation. Headlines didn't mention the years of abuse, only the knife, the penis, and the woman who went crazy. But behind the lurid headlines, something more important was starting to take shape. For the first time, the American public was being forced to confront not just a shocking act, but the years of domestic violence that preceded it. And for Lorena, who sat in a jail cell awaiting charges, her story was finally about to be heard. Whether people on June 24, 1993, news of the Bobbitt case broke like wildfire across the country. Morning shows, newspapers, and tabloids exploded with sensational headlines: wife cuts off husband's manhood, Bobbittized, and love hurts. What had happened in the small town of Manassas was now the most talked about story in America. Within hours, media trucks surrounded the hospital and the Bobbitt apartment complex. News anchors speculated wildly. Comedians cracked jokes. Radio shock jocks ran crude sound effects. Late-night hosts turned the incident into monologues. It was a media frenzy of unprecedented proportions, fueled by a mix of shock, amusement, and deeply ingrained gender stereotypes. Lost in the hysteria was Lorena herself. After turning herself in and speaking to police, she was booked and charged with malicious wounding, a serious felony that carried the possibility of up to 20 years in prison. She was released on bail and placed under strict court supervision. The cameras swarmed wherever she went, capturing her every step like a celebrity in a scandal. John, on the other hand, was painted as the helpless victim. As he recovered in the hospital, surrounded by microphones and reporters, his injury became a national punchline. But his public image as a wounded husband began to crack under scrutiny. As more details of the Bobbitt's toxic marriage came to light, the narrative started to shift. Investigators discovered a trail of domestic violence reports, hospital visits, and witness statements. Lorena had confided in coworkers, friends, and even her employer about John's abuse. Court documents from a past arrest painted John as aggressive, manipulative, and dangerous. Yet, the mainstream media, still largely male-dominated, clung to the more salacious side of the story, a scorned woman taking revenge on her husband's manhood. Meanwhile, women's rights activists and survivors of domestic abuse began to rally around Lorena. To them, she wasn't a crazed wife, she was a symbol of what happens when years of suffering are ignored. Her act, while extreme, was seen by many as an eruption of bottled-up trauma, the desperate act of someone who had run out of options. Talk shows began to explore the deeper themes behind the incident. Experts on abuse and trauma were interviewed. The discussion was no longer just about what Lorena did, it was about why she did it. And that conversation was long overdue. By the end of the summer, the Bobbitt case had transformed from tabloid fodder into a national debate. Issues of domestic violence, marital rape, immigrant vulnerability, and gender roles were suddenly on front pages and in living rooms across America. It was messy, uncomfortable, and controversial, but it was also necessary. Lorena's trial was set for early 1994. The prosecution would argue she acted with malice. The defense would argue temporary insanity driven by years of abuse. It is one of the most watched and dissected trials of the decade. The world buzzed with anticipation. Her face had become as familiar as any Hollywood star's. Yet most people only knew her through headlines. Beneath the media noise, a legal storm was brewing. Lorena's defense team, led by attorney Blair Howard, began preparing for what they knew would be an uphill battle. Not just against the prosecution, but against public opinion. John Bobbitt had already had his day in court, in a sense. In November 1993, he was tried on charges of marital sexual assault, the very act Lorena claimed triggered her violent response. His defense argued the sex was consensual. Lorena took the stand, trembling, detailing years of physical and emotional abuse. Her testimony was harrowing. She described being raped, beaten, controlled, and humiliated. But it wasn't enough. The jury deliberated just a few hours before acquitting John of all charges. Legally, he walked away untouched. Emotionally, the outcome left Lorena devastated. Still, the seeds of public doubt about John's innocence had been planted. Now it was her turn to stand trial. Charged with malicious wounding, Lorena faced up to 20 years in prison if convicted. Her defense strategy hinged on temporary insanity, a psychological break brought on by years of trauma. Mental health experts who examined her supported the claim, diagnosing her with clinical depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. The courtroom would become a battleground between two starkly different narratives. The prosecution portrayed Lorena as a woman driven by jealousy and rage, someone who chose a brutal, premeditated act of revenge. The defense framed her as a battered woman pushed beyond her limits, reacting in an altered state of mind after suffering years of unchecked abuse. Public interest surged once again. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. News crews broadcast every moment. Inside, Lorena sat quietly, often in tears, as her life was dissected piece by piece. But for the first time, her voice was being heard in full, not just as a punchline, but as a human being with a story shaped by fear, control, and survival. Her attorneys carefully brought forward witnesses, friends, co-workers, even police, who had seen bruises, heard her cries for help, or listened as she described her suffering. It was a painful recounting, but a necessary one. The stage was set. Two versions of Lorena stood before the jury, the vengeful wife and the broken survivor. Over the next few weeks, her trial officially began in January 1994 at the Prince William County Courthouse in Manassas, Virginia. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken by reporters, curious locals, legal experts, and women's advocates. The air buzzed with tension and anticipation. Everyone wanted to see what would unfold in the most sensational trial of the decade. Lorena appeared subdued, dressed modestly, and often looking down. Her demeanor contrasted sharply with the media's portrayal of her as a wild, unstable figure. The defense knew image mattered, and every detail, from her clothing to her quiet tone, was carefully considered. Their goal was simple: present Lorena as a battered woman who had reached a psychological breaking point. The prosecution opened with a firm stance. They portrayed Lorena's act as intentional, vengeful, and cruel. They painted her as jealous and controlling, suggesting she had lashed out not out of fear, but because she couldn't handle rejection. They showed photos of the knife, detailed the logistics of the event, and emphasized how she had left the scene and thrown the severed organ out the window. To them, that act showed calm calculation, not madness. But the defense countered with something far more complex, a deep dive into the years of abuse Lorena endured. They called witnesses who confirmed John's violent behavior, including friends who had seen bruises, heard her sobbing, or watched her slowly unravel. Mental health professionals testified that Lorena suffered from clinical depression and PTSD, and that on the night of the incident she experienced a dissociative episode, meaning she wasn't fully aware of what she was doing. Lorena herself took the stand in a moment that gripped the nation. Her voice trembled as she recounted the years of physical abuse, the forced abortion, the verbal degradation, and the final assault on the night in question. It was raw and emotional. At times she wept. At times the courtroom sat silent, heavy with the weight of her words. Meanwhile, the jury listened closely, taking notes, watching both legal teams with careful eyes. What they had to decide wasn't whether Lorena did it, she had admitted as much, but whether she was temporarily insane at the time. If they believed her actions stemmed from an unmeditated psychological break caused by trauma, she would be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the emotional intensity made it feel much longer. As closing arguments were delivered, it became clear this was no longer just a criminal case, it was a cultural moment. The world was watching, not just to find out what happened to Lorena, but to understand how justice would treat a woman who fought back against abuse in the most shocking way imaginable. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict in the case of Lorena Bobbitt. The courtroom was tense. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready, while spectators held their breath. Lorena sat nervously beside her attorneys, awaiting the decision that would determine her future. The foreperson stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Lorena Bobbitt, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a flurry of emotion. Lorena wept quietly. Some in the courtroom sighed in relief, while others appeared surprised or even outraged. Legally, the verdict meant the jury had accepted that Lorena was not in control of her actions due to a mental health crisis brought on by years of abuse. But the case wasn't over yet. Because the verdict hinged on temporary insanity, Lorena was not immediately freed. The judge ordered her to undergo a 45-day psychiatric evaluation at Central State Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia. There, doctors would determine if she posed any ongoing threat to herself or others. It was a routine part of such verdicts, but it extended her confinement. During that time, Lorena was kept under tight observation. She cooperated fully, met with psychiatrists, and participated in evaluations. The results were clear. She was no longer a danger. She had acted in a moment of psychological crisis, and there was no sign of continued instability. After her release, Lorena returned home quietly. But quiet wasn't something easily maintained in her life anymore. Though legally free, she remained trapped in the spotlight. The press continued to follow her. Tabloids speculated on her every move, and jokes about her case echoed across pop culture. Late-night comedians still referenced her, often reducing her story to a punchline, ignoring the pain and trauma underneath. For Lorena, the years that followed were a difficult balance between reclaiming her life and surviving her notoriety. She worked to rebuild privately, returning to work, supporting her family, and eventually becoming a voice for survivors of abuse. But the shadow of the case loomed large. Wherever she went, people recognized her. Meanwhile, John Wayne Bobbitt took a very different path. He embraced the attention, granting interviews, attending public events, and even starring in adult films that exploited his infamy. His behavior, erratic, attention-seeking, and sometimes disturbing, only deepened public suspicion about who he truly was. The verdict may have ended the legal battle, but the cultural battle continued. For many, Lorena became a symbol of resistance, a woman who had finally snapped after suffering too long. For others, the case remained a source of crude humor. But underneath all the noise was a human story, of pain, survival, and a woman trying to find peace in a world that had turned her from Central State Hospital. Lorena Bobbitt tried to return to a sense of normalcy. But how do you go back to normal when the entire world knows your name, your face, and the most painful chapter of your life? The trial may have ended, but Lorena's life in the public eye had just begun. She moved back in with close friends and stayed largely out of the public for a while. Though she avoided the cameras, reporters continued to hunt for updates. Every job she applied for, every place she moved to, her past followed. Some treated her with sympathy, others whispered and gawked. To many, she was still that woman, the one who did that thing. But Lorena was determined not to let that moment define her. She began attending community college classes and sought stability through work and advocacy. Over time, she found purpose speaking out for other survivors of domestic abuse. Slowly, carefully, she rebuilt her life, not for headlines, but for herself. Meanwhile, John Wayne Bobbitt fully embraced his infamy. He appeared on talk shows, granted bizarre interviews, and even starred in several adult films that played off the case. His public behavior drew both curiosity and criticism. He claimed to have forgiven Lorena, but his words often felt more like mockery than grace. He later went on to be arrested multiple times for domestic violence against other women, an eerie echo of Lorena's own testimony. Over the years, Lorena kept a low profile but quietly worked on something more lasting. She founded an organization to support victims of domestic violence. Through this, she visited shelters, offered resources, and used her platform to raise awareness. Her tone was never vengeful, it was about education, empathy, and prevention. In the early 2000s, the media's view of Lorena began to shift. Documentaries and in-depth interviews started to revisit her case with more nuance. Instead of laughing about the incident, journalists were asking why it happened. They explored the cycles of abuse, the stigma around marital rape, and the failure of the system to protect vulnerable women, especially immigrants like Lorena. Her courage in speaking out, even when she could have faded into silence, became a kind of quiet revolution. She didn't choose fame. She chose to survive it. Years later, in interviews, Lorena has reflected on that time not with bitterness, but with a sense of duty. "I'm not the same person I was in 1993, she once said. But that person still lives in me. She reminds me why I do this." And through it all, Lorena never changed her name. She refused to run from her past. Instead, she transformed it, turning trauma into strength and infamy into Lorena Bobbitt had fully embraced her role as a speaker and advocate for domestic violence survivors. But as she stepped into this new life, the question of her personal healing lingered in the background. She had spent so much time helping others that it often felt like she was putting her own recovery on hold. It wasn't until she finally took some time for herself, away from the cameras, away from the constant barrage of media attention, that she could reflect on what her past truly meant. Lorena relocated to Florida, away from the constant public eye, and began to rebuild her personal life. She met a man who, over time, became her partner. For the first time in years, Lorena allowed herself to trust again, but only after years of therapy and deep emotional work. She wasn't the same woman who had endured years of silence and suffering. She was stronger, wiser, but still vulnerable. Her advocacy work continued, and she began to partner with various national and local organizations to create safe spaces for survivors. She worked alongside lawyers, activists, and therapists, helping to change laws and policies aimed at protecting those in abusive relationships. Domestic violence, which had once been a largely invisible issue, was finally being acknowledged and addressed in public forums, thanks in part to the revelations that came from Lorena's story. However, the media never quite let her escape her past. In 2003, a documentary titled The Lorena Bobbitt Story aired on the Lifetime Network, which attempted to capture her life before, during, and after the infamous incident. The film painted her as a victim of both her marriage and the public's insatiable need for scandal. Lorena expressed mixed feelings about the film, recognizing its role in keeping her message alive, but also feeling conflicted about reliving the trauma for entertainment purposes. While the documentary stirred old memories, Lorena's focus was clear: to ensure the conversation about abuse continued, without the sensationalism. She became involved in initiatives that empowered women to break free from abusive relationships, regardless of their backgrounds or nationalities. Throughout this period, John Wayne Bobbitt's life, meanwhile, continued to spiral. He faced several arrests, including charges related to assaulting other women. His post-trial life stood in stark contrast to Lorena's quiet activism and healing. While he continued to seek attention, Lorena used her platform to encourage real change, often turning down interview requests unless they would promote awareness around domestic violence. By 2010, Lorena married her longtime partner, and the couple had a child together. For the first time, she felt a sense of completeness, not defined by her past, but by her future and the family she had created. Though her story would never be erased from the public consciousness, Lorena no longer allowed it to define her. Lorena Bobbitt had transformed her life into something meaningful, despite the media's fixation on her past. As she settled into a quieter life in Florida, she continued her advocacy for domestic violence survivors. Over the years, Lorena worked alongside numerous organizations to push for stronger protections for women in abusive relationships. Her focus wasn't on her infamous act, but on helping those who had endured similar suffering. She met a supportive partner, and together they raised a family. This new chapter allowed Lorena to begin healing on her terms, away from the scrutiny that had followed her for so long. Though she remained dedicated to helping others, it was through her personal life that she found the peace she'd always been searching for. In 2003, Lorena was featured in a Lifetime documentary titled The Lorena Bobbitt Story. The film attempted to capture her entire journey, showing her transformation from the woman in the headlines to the advocate she had become. Though she supported the project for its focus on her post-trial life and advocacy, reliving the traumatic moments of her past was difficult. Still, it gave her an opportunity to share her message about domestic violence, a topic that had gained more attention in the years following her trial. Despite the media continuing to focus on the scandalous aspects of her story, Lorena found ways to redirect the conversation. She spoke on behalf of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence and worked with other organizations to provide resources for women escaping abusive situations. Her message was clear. It wasn't about the sensationalized incident, but about raising awareness and empowering survivors. Meanwhile, John Wayne Bobbitt's life followed a different path. After their divorce, he made a public spectacle of himself, appearing on talk shows and starring in adult films. His arrests for various offenses, including domestic violence, underscored the abusive behavior Lorena had described during her trial. Unlike Lorena, who worked to heal, John seemed to thrive in the attention and drama surrounding his name. In 2010, Lorena married her longtime partner, and the couple had a child together. For the first time, she could embrace her life without the baggage of her past overshadowing every moment. She found peace in her family and the new sense of normalcy she had longed for. While her story would always be a part of the public consciousness, it no longer defined her. Today, Lorena continues to be a voice for those who have suffered in silence. Her legacy is one of resilience, empowerment, and change. She turned her painful experience into a catalyst for social progress, working to ensure that no woman would have to endure what she did. In the end, Lorena Bobbitt's story wasn't about violence. It was about the public perception of Lorena Bobbitt evolved. The media, which once painted her as a villain, slowly began to understand her as a victim of a broken system, one that allowed her abuser to thrive while she suffered in silence. The turning point came when the conversation about domestic violence gained more traction in the 2000s. Lorena had never sought fame. She had simply been thrust into the limelight by an act of desperation. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, people began to see the complexity of her situation. More and more, the public discourse shifted from sensationalism to a deeper examination of the systemic issues surrounding domestic violence. Lorena's decision to speak out about her experience made her a reluctant figurehead for survivors of abuse. Advocacy groups reached out, recognizing her as a powerful symbol of what can happen when an individual reaches their breaking point after years of suffering. Instead of being just another tabloid headline, she became a voice for change. Her story also encouraged others to come forward. Survivors who had once been too afraid to speak up about their own experiences began sharing their stories, knowing they would be met with understanding rather than judgment. Lorena's advocacy focused not on the past, but on the future, how society could better support those trapped in abusive relationships and prevent tragedies like hers. In interviews, Lorena often emphasized that domestic violence didn't discriminate by class, race, or background. She made it clear that abuse could happen to anyone, and that leaving an abusive relationship wasn't as simple as just walking away. She hoped her journey would inspire change in laws, society's view of women in abusive relationships, and the way mental health was handled in cases of domestic trauma. Her transformation from the subject of a media circus to a powerful advocate was not without challenges. It was difficult to balance her public persona with her desire for privacy, but she understood the importance of her voice. Her past may have been used to sell newspapers and attract viewers, but her present was about helping those who had suffered as she had. Lorena's journey wasn't just about healing herself. It was about transforming a moment of unimaginable pain into a force for positive change. Though the world may never forget her name, she worked tirelessly to ensure her legacy would be more than just the punchline of a tabloid joke. Her legacy would be one of survival, strength, and advocacy for those who could not continue. Her advocacy for domestic violence survivors, she recognized that true change required not just individual healing but systemic reform. She had been through the worst, her life had been a spectacle, her trauma exposed to millions. But now she wanted to focus on building something meaningful, something that could help prevent future victims from enduring what she had. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the conversation around domestic violence began to shift. Public awareness campaigns gained momentum and laws started changing to provide better protections for women and children. Lorena became a visible part of this change. She worked with lawmakers and organizations to improve support systems for survivors, pushing for stronger legal frameworks, better shelters, and more educational resources for people who had suffered abuse. Her involvement in the movement was personal. Lorena knew that many women felt trapped, just as she had once been. Whether it was financial dependence, fear of retaliation, or lack of support, leaving an abusive relationship was rarely straightforward. She spoke about the importance of creating environments where survivors could access help without fear of judgment or reprisal. Her work also involved challenging societal norms that kept abuse hidden in the shadows. Many victims were silent, often because society had failed to recognize the signs of emotional and psychological abuse. Lorena used her platform to shed light on these often overlooked aspects of abusive relationships, making it clear that abuse wasn't just physical, it could be emotional, financial, and psychological. As Lorena's reputation as an advocate grew, she began to find peace with the public's perception of her. While the tabloids still used her name to grab attention, she no longer saw herself as a victim of the media. Instead, she took control of her narrative, using her experiences to educate and inspire others. By the time she was in her 40s, Lorena had finally settled into a life of relative normalcy. Her relationship with her family became a source of strength, and she enjoyed being a mother to her child. In private, she still dealt with the scars of her past, but in public, she stood as a strong, empowered woman who had turned her trauma into a force for good. In 2019, Lorena's impact was officially recognized when she was featured in a documentary series on Amazon Prime titled Lorena. The series revisited her life, focusing not just on the infamous incident, but on the journey of healing and advocacy she had embarked upon in the decades since. Lorena reflected on how far she had come, from the broken woman whose pain was turned into a media spectacle to the strong, compassionate advocate she had become. Her story, once a punchline, was now one of hope. And while Lorena Bobbitt's name would always be tied to a moment in history she had long since reclaimed, the trial, Lorena Bobbitt focused on reclaiming her life. The public's fascination with her story began to fade, but the emotional toll of the years of scrutiny remained. Despite the media frenzy surrounding her name, she continued to push forward, not for attention but for healing and empowerment. Her advocacy work became a cornerstone of her life. Lorena spoke at conferences and appeared on talk shows to discuss the realities of domestic violence, mental health, and the importance of support systems for survivors. She emphasized the need for public awareness and education about abusive relationships, how they could begin subtly and escalate over time, leaving victims trapped in fear and shame. In interviews, Lorena often reflected on the emotional journey she had undergone since that fateful night. She had spent so many years of her life surviving first the trauma of abuse, then the trial and its aftermath. But now she was focused on living. For the first time in a long while, Lorena was no longer defined by a single, dramatic moment in her life. Her story had evolved into something much larger than just an incident. It was a story of resilience, recovery, and purpose. Despite the ongoing public interest, Lorena worked to stay grounded. She valued her privacy and focused on her family. Her relationship with her partner was built on mutual respect and understanding, something she had never experienced with John. She was a mother now, and her child became her priority. Raising her child in an environment of love and stability was the ultimate way to heal from the scars of her past. Her advocacy efforts were also bolstered by her participation in the creation of organizations dedicated to helping survivors of domestic violence. Lorena's voice became a vital part of a national conversation about the need for stronger protections for women and children in abusive situations. She worked to raise funds for shelters, legal services, and psychological counseling for those affected by domestic violence. However, it wasn't just about giving speeches or attending events. Lorena often took the time to meet with women who had escaped abusive situations, offering them personal support and guidance. She understood the isolation that many victims felt, and she wanted to make sure they knew they weren't alone. By 2019, Lorena's advocacy and personal growth culminated in a new project, Lorena, a 4-part documentary series on Amazon Prime. The series revisited her story, providing a more nuanced, balanced view of her life before, during, and after the infamous incident. Through this series, Lorena was finally able to share her truth, one that went beyond the media narrative, focusing on her survival and the work she had done to help others. Her transformation was now complete, from tabloid sensation to respected advocate. Lorena Bobbitt had reclaimed her voice and used it to create a legacy of hope. Lorena Bobbitt had firmly cemented herself as not just a figure from a controversial past, but as a respected advocate and a voice for change. Her journey had been difficult, and her path to healing had taken years of effort, resilience, and self-discovery. Yet, through all the challenges and setbacks, Lorena's transformation from the subject of a media circus to a strong, empowered woman was complete. Throughout her life, Lorena remained focused on helping others. She continued her work as an advocate for survivors of domestic violence, working alongside various organizations to improve legal protections and raise awareness about the importance of mental health support. Her public appearances, though less frequent, were filled with wisdom and compassion, showing the depth of her experience and the growth she had undergone. While the world would always remember the sensational details of the 1993 incident, Lorena's ultimate legacy was rooted in the work she did to make a difference in the lives of others. She had never set out to be a public figure, but through her own survival, she had become a symbol of hope for countless individuals who felt trapped in abusive relationships. Lorena's voice, once used to tell a story of trauma, was now a tool for healing and change. Her personal life, too, had found stability. After years of turmoil, she was able to embrace a life of quiet peace, surrounded by the love of her family. The scars of her past were always there, but they no longer defined her. She had found a sense of fulfillment in helping others, in raising her child, and in the relationships she had built. Lorena's story was one of immense personal strength. She had survived a system that failed her, a public that judged her, and the trauma of an abusive marriage. Yet, she had turned those experiences into a platform for good, working tirelessly to change the conversation around domestic violence and to ensure that future generations would be better equipped to handle the complexities of abusive relationships. In the end, Lorena Bobbitt's legacy was not built on one night of violence or the media spectacle that followed. It was built on years of advocacy, healing, and a commitment to ensuring that survivors of domestic abuse had a voice and a future. Her story had come full circle, from tabloid fodder to a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. The end.